Welcome to the Painting of the Week podcast, where we look at some of the most significant paintings throughout history. Introducing your hosts, Phil Grabsky and Laura Bentham.
Welcome to this week's Painting of the Week. And it's a slightly unusual one this week because I am out and about, not with Laura. And in fact, I am in the United States with Elizabeth Thompson Colleary, who is an independent scholar of Edward and Jo Hopper and curator of an exhibition that I'm currently in at the Hopper House, or the Hopper'S house in Nyack, which is about, 20 miles north of New York. It's a very beautiful spot. It's a fabulous house, and it's a lovely exhibition. And we're going to talk about a particular painting, which is called Railroad. No, it's not. Yes, it is. It's called Railroad Gates, Gloucester, 1928. And it's painted not by Edward Hopper, but by his wife, Josephine Nivison Hopper, who we're going to talk about. But first of all, Elizabeth, why, and I have to say there are lots of really nice paintings or watercolours here by Jo. Why have you chosen this one?
It's an excellent work of art. It's beautifully crafted. It's an excellent example of the quality of Jo's artistry. She was a beautiful watercolor painter. Her watercolor paintings were highly regarded in her lifetime. It's also a seminal work in that when it was first discovered, it established definitively that the Hoppers did in fact paint side by side. These paintings were discovered recently, just in 2000, at the home of a private collector who was a Hopper family friend. And prior to that, Hopper had really crafted this image of himself as this solitary soul. And many things he wrote and interviews he gave, he spoke of being alone in this location and alone in that location. Well, close to a dozen of these watercolors by Jo came out of the basement of a private collector's home, and lo and behold, they are identical compositions to works painted by her husband. Now, here at the exhibition, in addition to Jo's view of the railroad gates in Gloucester from 1928, we have a reproduction of Edward's identical painting of the railroad gates from 1928, and the comparison is extraordinary.
So let me just point out, I'm sure you all know by now, but if you go to seventh-art.com, and you go to the podcast part of the website, you'll see both the pictures. You'll see Jo's, and alongside it, you'll see Edward's, so you can make your own comparison.
So what's interesting about the work, and as the curator of the exhibition, I have to say, after the watercolors emerged, two things occurred. One was the realization that Jo was a significant artist in her own right. Prior to the discovery of this body of work, I'd been looking for Jo's work for well over a decade. And for the most part, it had been dispersed after she passed. They did not have children, and the work of both Edward and Jo went into various different collections. And Jo's work either was given away or in some cases destroyed, basically lost is what I kept hearing. So this body of work, the emergence of this body of work was extraordinary, not only for the reestablishing of her career, also in addition to the work, there were notebooks that she kept listing exhibitions that she had taken part in, and she had a very significant exhibition record. She was showing with all the most prominent American modernists of the day. I should also say, for anyone who's interested, in 2004, after studying this body of work and also other works by Jo that were located at the Whitney Museum, I published an article in the Woman's Art Journal. And a lot of what I'm sharing now is documented in that article in 2004. It's the rediscovery of Josephine Nivison Hopper. So the work on one level established her as the artist in her own right that we hadn't been able to study. But again, it positioned her right next to her very famous husband. And so it was the opportunity to see what is and was a two-artist marriage. And up until now, that hadn't been possible.
Obviously, the most famous paintings of Hopper are those scenes of New York, those scenes of New York, Nighthawks, and so many others. Is there evidence that she has been alongside him in those environments, or are those pictures much more constructed in the studio and she's in her own studio doing something completely different? And are we really talking about when they came up out of New York in the summer months? It's a slightly different time of year where they would sit next to each other and paint. So this is very much something that only happens, as I say, in the summer.
It's an excellent question, and most of the examples of them painting side by side have emerged during their travels. In this case, they were in Gloucester before they married. They built a home in Truro on Cape Cod, and they spent 6 months of the year in Truro for 30 some odd years until they passed. And many of the side by side paintings were done there as well, as they were on their travels through the Southwest. So no, and it's an excellent point about New York City, because Hopper didn't paint on site in New York City, meaning he wasn't sitting on the sidewalk painting what he saw across from him. The word constructed, I believe, is the one Phil used, and that's an excellent example. He did lots of sketches and then went back to the studio and basically constructed the finished image. Now, with that said, the images that are identical or similar are the views from their home. They lived on Washington Square Park, and there are the apartment they lived in is still there. It's owned by New York University, can be visited on occasion by appointment. But there are views that they both did of the interior of their apartment at Washington Square and window views. So there are some Washington Square views where they were both drawing the same thing. But to the best of my knowledge, they were not finished as watercolors or work that was exhibited, but they did sketch side by side.
No, I have watched an online presentation about the works of Edward and Jo, and an example was given where they're painting next to each other. But in this particular occasion, there was a real sense of, but you can see that Edward is the better painter. And I just wondered what your view is of that. And indeed, take this example. If you didn't know who had painted which, would you be able to say immediately,
Yeah.
Well, that's Jo and that's Edward. Edward's a bit better here. Or would that not be your response?
It's a fabulous question, and it's one that I am often asked when I've lectured in various different places, and the question always comes up. And not to be totally crass, it is often framed by, well, how much is his worth and how much is hers worth? And in my slideshow, I have other examples of paintings that are in fact identical. And his is I think they're going for $90 million. His is something that would be in the $30 million range. And Jo's work, whenever it's shown, is valued in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. We have no record of recent sales, and so therefore we have to go back to what they were approximately worth in her lifetime. Better is a hard word to define. Even in Jo's lifetime, the critics, the gallery owners who were handling Ed's work on occasion did show hers. And there are a few famous quotes, one from, I believe it was from Frank Rand or John Clancy, both of whom were Hopper's dealer at one point. And they came and looked at her work and they said, she's a good painter. She's a good painter, but he's a great painter. And so the question becomes, again, back to the word better. Now, a couple of other thoughts on that. I've, again, shown Jo's work to numerous people in the years since I found it, professionals, museum curators. One has said, well, yeah, her work is damn good if it could pass for his. So let's look at it that way. We also have to contextualize it within the life of women artists in the 1920s. Who was being shown, who was being looked at. Now, again, her exhibition record was very substantial. She was shown with John Marin, Charles Prendergast, all the major American modernists Jo was included in their exhibitions. I just found a document recently that confirms Charles Birchfield, who's the subject of a big exhibition at the Whitney. His first exhibition in New York City was a two-person show with Jo Hopper. Jo on one wall, Charles Birchfield on the other. So a lot of it is retelling the story. The judgments we make now based on what we see on the wall, those judgments are contextualized within what we have known for past decades, or what we think we knew. And now there's new work and the story is being told and the exhibition record is emerging, so on and so forth. Short answer is this: he was a much better oil painter than Jo was. Watercolor was her strength. And the other piece we can't leave out is that he didn't paint in watercolor until they started courting in Gloucester in the summer of 1923. Prior to that, he was not a watercolor painter. And he came asking her to go out on sketching trips, and they started painting watercolor together. And then when they came back to New York, his watercolors were shown at the Brooklyn Museum. He sold the first painting he'd sold in 10 years, and Frank Wren came in, saw his watercolors, gave him an exhibit. It sold out, and his career skyrocketed, all over painting watercolors with Jo in Gloucester in the summer of 1923.
It does also raise that very important area and question about the extent to which value is attributed to what we think we know of somebody's biography and personality, and indeed their gender. Mm-hmm. So if these pictures arrived on the market and nobody knew who they were by, whether they would be valued at $5,000 to $10,000 or $91 million. And of course, that's part of the ambition of a film, is to, I guess, to some extent, tell the story of an artist. And clearly with a film about Edward Hopper, that includes telling the story of Jo in as fresh a way as we can, in as accurate a way as we can, presenting the pictures when they arrive, and trying to divorce ourselves from the sense of, here's this one's sold for $91 million, and this one's sold for $30 million. And I just wonder, with these two, when you talk about him being a better oil painter, or her being being very accomplished as a watercolorist, what are the differences? What should we, when we're looking at these paintings, what should we see? I mean, there's the same scene. So what has she done that he hasn't? Or what has he done that she hasn't?
Excellent question. And it's interesting, too. You'll see them on the screen together, but the biggest difference in all these pairings, and there are many that came out of the basement that show them side by side, the biggest difference is the palette. And his, as you can see, is dark earth tones. He really never moved away from the rusts and the sepias and the browns and the charcoals and even his greens. Everything is very sort of muted and somber. That was his palette. It was his palette his entire life. Though one of my premises in this exhibition is that later on, his palette does become more infused with color, and that color clearly was influenced by Jo. Now, Jo, from the beginning, given her background, she had studied with American Impressionists, Ambrose Webster up on Cape Cod, so she was a brilliant colorist. And again, the artists she was showing with in New York, watercolor painters. And at that point, many of the major American modernist painters were working in watercolor. And the palette, I use the words poetic, lyrical. I can describe it to you. You'll see it in the photograph, but the turquoise shades in the windows, and the salmon and sort of fuchsia colors on the chimneys. I mean, the range of colors, there are rich yellows and blues and greens, and that sort of wall in the foreground that has, again, that sort of salmony pink color. So her palette was always, always bright. Now, if we were at that location, do we think that the window shades were turquoise and the chimney had a hint of fuchsia? Probably not. But at the same time, I look at Edwards, and I described this in the article I wrote. It looks like the Southwest. It looks like adobe. Now, granted, the brightness of the highlights and the darkness of the shadows are sort of signature Ed. But the other point that I make is he handles, even at this point, and he'd only been painting watercolor for about 4 years, he handles watercolor like gouache. There's a density, there's an opacity to the way he's handling watercolor here that is totally different from the way Jo paints. Jo paints with washes. She works with lots of water. You can see she controls them, but she builds up her surface like the grassy area in the front of the painting. Those are layered washes. Now, in his case, again, I keep going back to gouache. There's a density and an opacity to the way he handles watercolor that it could be in oil. It could easily be in oil. And so that difference in technique, even though he's using watercolor, and it took some time. His later watercolors do have more of the feeling of the fluidity that we associate with the watercolor medium, but not in this work.
Can you explain for people what gouache?
Yes, gouache is a water-based pigment that's dense. It's dense and it's thicker. So it is water-based. It's not as thick as oil, and it's easier to manipulate because it's not an oil-based or an acrylic-based, but it's dense and dense and opaque. So gouache, when you're working with gouache, it's almost like a very heavy tempera. That's what I would say the best comparison. But there's no way you can do a loose fluid wash with gouache. It just doesn't permit it. And some of the areas here where the darker brown buildings over on the right, even the way he paints the sort of house beneath or next to the railroad tracks, all of that does not feel like watercolor. It doesn't have the fluidity. The only area that does really is the foreground with the grass. But the palette is very different. The handling of the paint is very different.
Is the size of the canvas the same?
Yes, that's interesting. The Hoppers were notoriously frugal. So yes, they bought all the paper in exactly the same size. And in some cases, they trim a little bit here or there, but otherwise they're identical in size. Though what is interesting, there's another example here where they painted the same view, and she painted hers with the paper vertically, and he painted his with the paper horizontally. And the anecdote about that, Joe may have even commented, was that he was 6'5", or a little bit taller, and she was barely 5 feet. So she painted vertically to have a canvas that soared up, and he painted horizontally to have the feeling of being lower to the ground. So that was interesting.
And do you know why they were in Gloucester?
Yes, summer of 1928. They had first been to Gloucester in 1924 after they married. In fact, it was very funny. After they had dated in Gloucester in 23, started courting, they went back to New York and they were keeping company. In 1924, they were deciding where they would go. And artists in New York City all went to various seaside locales for the summer to paint. And Joe wanted to go to Provincetown, and Ed wanted to go to Gloucester. I believe it was on the 9th of July, 1924. And Joe said, I'll go to Gloucester if we get married today. And they got married that day.
Really?
And so they went to Gloucester, yes. And that was in 1924. And then they returned in 1928. Again, it was a popular location, not to make it all about one's income, but the 24 Gloucester watercolors were very popular. There was a market for them with the dealers in New York. So they may have gone back in 28 thinking this is a good source for us, but it was also a thriving art community. Many artists were there. They were welcomed. There were cheap boarding houses where they could stay. So I think, in fact, it's an interesting question because it opens up the larger issue of subject matter in Hopper's art. And we do know throughout his life he agonized over subjects. Sometimes he did a painting a year simply because he couldn't find anything. And Joe would write at length about, we drove here, he didn't see anything, I took him there, I thought we'd pick this or that. So his process of choosing something that would speak to him was an arduous one. And the fact that he did this many in Gloucester meant it was appealing.
I find that extraordinary about Hopper, that length of time. I can't imagine wandering around for a year before taking a photograph.
Yeah.
But obviously, the relationship between them is something that the film explores and is really interesting and really important. You're the preeminent scholar in this area. So, do you imagine on this day that Joe is kind of trailing behind Edward with the easel? I'm like, both of them have got their easels on their backs and their materials in some bag around their shoulders or whatever. And do you think she's getting frustrated? It's like, Edward, just stop here. This is fine. That's Or do you think it's the two of them? Or do you think that she's the one saying, and he goes, okay. Yeah. I mean, how collaborative 50-50 is it? Or is it Edward saying, no, it's not good enough. It's not good enough. No, all right, here. And she's like, fine, okay, I'll sit next to you and I'll paint the same thing. It's
a great question, and it opens up a few different areas for response. One of them was that they had a car, And at one point, Jo had a minor bump on the car. And after that, Ed would not allow her to drive. So she was limited to painting the locations he chose. Now, the other part of it is that...
Which we should add was something that she really railed against.
Yes, oh, she did. She railed
thoroughly
against
fed
it.
up.
Yeah, thoroughly fed up.
Not being allowed to drive.
Yes, thoroughly fed up. And the other part of it was that... One of the what's significant about the emergence of this work and this whole idea of the two artists' marriage and of them being side by side is exactly that. In other words, when it came to the subject matter, the short answer would be he chose them. The other point is, and Jo wrote about this, their primary source of income was his work. If he's not producing those years when he did One Oil, we have all the correspondence where Frank Wren, his dealer, is writing and saying, I got an empty space on the wall. There isn't going to be any money coming in this year. The Met is waiting for him to finish something. And so Jo was very conscious of that. So I think as much as she may have felt drawn to one. In fact, there are several pieces here where clearly they were locations she could walk to. They were staying in Charleston together. He went over to one side of the town, she went to the other. So, but when it came to specific locations that they had to possibly get to by car, or again, this is early on. This is only 4 years after they were married. And so at this point, she was not as inclined to insert her independence in saying that, well, I want to go and do my own space.
So it's plausible that he's painting this thinking I have to do something for the sale.
Yes.
And she's just walking with him and she's like, well, while you're doing that, I'm going to do this.
Yes. Yeah, that could definitely be part of it. It's a great question because as much as I know in depth about Jo's work, I've looked at everything extant and I've read everything, is that I don't know that she would have chosen that locale. It's a little too angular for her. It's got a lot of sort of mechanical details and she's much more sort of about flowers and gardens and blowing skies. So it's a great question because I haven't pondered it before. But for example, in Nivison work, they didn't marry until she was 40. And so she was well established in her own vision as Jo Nivison before she took up with another mature artist. And in my own mind, I often compare Nivison versus Hopper because her style did evolve. And that would not have been a subject that Jo would have chosen.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me immediately is that Hopper's work is the work of somebody that is very alert. I mean, everyone talks about the light, of course, but what light does is it gives you angles and geometry. So, I mean, there are some films, for example, that look better in black and white because you're not distracted by the colour.
Yes.
It's all about the light. You know, I know people who say, don't like black and white films. Well, they're insane because if you watch certain black and white films, they are so well made because it's all about the way in which that scene is organised and lit and the way the actors are positioned and so on and so forth. You can almost imagine Hopper being quite content as a filmmaker to work in black and white. With Jo's work, I don't see that. What I see with Jo is that exploration and enjoyment of colour. And I mean, we talk about on the podcast, we do talk about colour theory quite a lot. Don't need to get into that here, but you can see that she's thought, well, what is the most appropriate colour to have of those chimneys? Because as you say, they probably aren't that colour, or, you know, certainly if you look at, you know, there's a difference between Edward's work and Jo's work as to the colour of the shutters and everything is different really, even the colour of the buildings themselves. So it's a different approach. And I guess the subsequent question is, to what extent, and this is dangerous territory, but to what extent does that reflect their personality?
That's exactly what I was going to interrupt you to make sure I had to say before we finish up. It is crucial. And in all the research I've done, and I published one article and I've got a book on its way to hopefully to publication soon, and I discuss this at great length. The personalities are so evident in the work. To describe Jo's work as lyrical and colorful and poetic and all of those those are adjectives we'd use to describe her. She was chatty, she was cheerful, she was personable, she loved life, she loved the world, engaging in every possible way. And that is absolutely the sentiment that comes through. Now, at the same time, she did study, her studies were with American Impressionist painters. And so the palette and the brushwork definitely comes, from those origins. So that was her training, but it was also suited to her temperament. That's one of my premises in terms of who is this woman as an artist. She's an artist who paints from her own soul, her own worldview, and it is passionate and cheerful, despite the fact that some of her most cheery, buoyant paintings were done during very difficult times in her life. Ed, on the other hand, go back to childhood. He was shy, he was withdrawn, he was introverted. Not that he saw the world as a dark place, but he did not have the kind of embrace of the world as a colorful place. And again, the emphasis on the geometry, angularity, all of that was very much in keeping with his character. And I don't like to say it in a pejorative way, and when I've written about it, I've chosen other words, but for the purpose of casual conversation, gloomy and dour are words that are used repeatedly to describe his palette. When you, especially compared to Jo's, but even his works in their own right, the colors are dark and gloomy. Now, you do have that raking bright sunlight, but it's almost too bright. There's a sharpness to it that makes it feel like this wouldn't be such a comfortable place to occupy. But everything about the way he paints as an expression of his worldview. One other thing I just wanted to say quickly, and I will give you access to the images if you like. He did a series of caricatures, little drawings of the Hoppers together, and one of them shows them going off to paint. And he's about 7 feet tall, and she comes up literally to his elbow, and he is carrying her easel under his arm, and she's holding her paint box. It's adorable, and you see them from behind. That's and great. They're on their way to paint the South Truro Church in the distance. But yeah, very much so.
Two more things. First thing is, when I first talked to somebody about making a film about Hopper, this particular person's reaction was, well, that's going to be a struggle because he never says anything and he's a miserable old so-and-so. And actually, the one thing that's really struck me more than anything else, well, actually, there's a couple of things that struck me about Hopper. One is there's so much more to Hopper than New York. The New York images, which are so popular. There's so much more to him and his art. But the other thing is, actually, he may not have written or been interviewed or spoken as frequently as other artists, but when he does, it's very articulate, it's very interesting, it's actually quite revealing. He's not as closed off. I mean, there's plenty of quotes where he talks about his process and how, his art is a reflection of his inner world what's the other one? If I could say it in words, I wouldn't paint. I mean,
I didn't need to paint it, yeah.
And actually, even the short snippets of his interviews, he looks a bit uncomfortable, but he's actually quite funny at times.
Yes.
So actually, there's much more to him.
It has been said that measured is the word often used to describe. He chose his words carefully, unlike others who babble incessantly, and that was said about Jo. But that there has been an equation made between the way he painted and the way he spoke. It's been pointed out, and again, when you have the opportunity to see these original works, as I have when I've studied them, every brushstroke is deliberate. If there's a blade of grass blowing to the right, the brushstroke goes to the right. Everything is very, very carefully and methodically planned, no matter how spontaneous it might appear. But that deliberation is paramount in terms of his style. He did many preparatory sketches and drawings, so by the time he got to the painting, everything was going exactly where it should, as I think his words. His words were few, but very carefully chosen.
Well, that also comes across. He's absolutely consumed, isn't he, by... we talk about artists having a passion for their craft, but this is a man who is totally consumed by the act of painting. And again, you read, the books that he reads, the French philosophy and poetry, and taking aid, going to try and find exactly the right sky or the right dog. I've dealt with so many artists who go to extremes, but this is somebody who it's quite noticeable. Like you say, just the right brushstroke for a blade of grass. It's quite something. Let me finish by saying it's wonderful to be in the house in which he's born, and this is where your exhibition is. I mean, how important is an understanding and appreciation of this building, of his parents, of Nyack, of where we are on the Hudson River, which is gorgeous, by the way, in understanding the biography, but more to the point, understanding his art?
Absolutely. And I should say, just by way of history, I've curated a couple or 2 or 3 exhibitions here at Hopper'S house. I first came in 2011, and they were doing, I believe it was the 40th anniversary of the people of Nyack saving the house from the wrecking ball. And they saved the house as a historic home. It has national designation as National Historic Trust. And when I came in to do that exhibition for the 40th anniversary, I was asked how I would go about it. And I was the first time I'd really given it much thought. And the more I studied and shared also my observations with other Hopper scholars, we all came to the conclusion that the years he spent here are absolutely critical. In fact, that exhibition was called Prelude, the Nyack years. And the premise was that really the artist he became, as I think we've spoken about earlier, and Hopper actually said that the seeds are sown. The curatorial statement for that exhibition was basically written by Hopper. And he said the seeds are sown. And again, not to make it all about multi-million-dollar, but many of the paintings he made later in his life, his masterworks, Victorian houses, storefronts, small town USA, you can find those identical views in the town of Nyack. The other thing that's interesting is he had a bedroom here into his 20s. He did not permanently relocate to New York City until he was almost 30. So he was back and forth to Nyack when he was to and from Paris. So it was very much a home base. So it's not as if he left and never returned. But the seeds were sown here for the mature masterworks. There's no doubt about it. And it's interesting that now the house is getting the recognition and the profile that it deserves. And again, when I was invited to the exhibition, it was revelatory for me. And anyone looking at Hopper since then has come to the same conclusion. You can't understand who he became if you don't understand where he came from. And again, that is very much the charming town of Nyack on the banks of the Hudson, visible from Hopper's bedroom upstairs.
And a very, very easy day trip from New York. Easy-ish. Your book that you're currently writing, has it got a title? If people want to get hold of that, do you know when it's likely to be? Are you going to set yourself now? You're going to say it's going to be ready by X?
Yes. I'm going to tell my editor that's the date. I would think summer 23. In fact, when we first talked about the projects that are surrounding the exhibition and the films that are being done, we were thinking 23. It's for the most part written. It is written. Part of the challenge is that a good deal of the book is going to focus on Jo, and it's looking at the two artists' marriage. And this is, in fact, as a closing thought, when I first discovered her work and started writing about her, I was spoken to with scorn when I was called a revisionist feminist art historian. You're one of those revisionist feminist art historians. And I said, well, the woman's work literally landed in my lap. I thought it was interesting and worthy, and I've been working on it for more than a decade. But then just recently, I was speaking with one of the curators at the Whitney and a few other people, and they said with great praise, you're a revisionist feminist art historian. So over the arc of time, it's gone from being scorned to being praised. And all that means is that Jo, like so many other women artists of her generation who were forgotten and lost, is reemerging. And not only is she reemerging as an artist well deserving of the recognition, but she's helping us to retell, to revise, if you will, to recontextualize the story of Edward Hopper. And that is significant in and of itself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Painting of the Week podcast. For more information, please visit our website at seventh-art.com or contact us by emailing info@seventh-art.com. See you next time.